Hey, Drew, I think you are biased.
Dude, so are you.
Yeah. Here's the thing. We all are biased, but how do we process it? There's many different
Mm.
biases that we may have, but how do we still have a bias and then show love to people around us? That's what we're going to talk about next. Well, welcome to the Eyes on Jesus podcast with Drew and Tim. We're here with you today, and we are excited to talk to you about today's topic, biases. Drew, how you
Yeah.
doing today?
I'm doing great. It's a rainy day here in North Carolina. My kids are out of school for the summer, which is different. It's a different thing. It's a
I'm
different
bored.
morning, right?
We're
So
going
we're
to hear a lot
trying
of
to
that.
get into we're trying to get into the new flow, new rhythms, and this is constant. Once you have kids, you got to figure out new rhythms, new weekly rhythms, new daily rhythms. So we're in that process, day one. So I'm trying to give myself a little bit of grace, give my family a little bit of grace today. And I'm thankful to have a little break and be here to talk with you about biases and how we can really just discover and acknowledge, like, hey, we all have them, but now, like, what do we do with that? And what do we do, with them and with that thought process? And how do we
Yeah.
extend grace to others? So I think it's a really great topic, especially in the world that we live in. But what about you? What's new with you?
Oh man, I'm biased against technology. This morning I had an hour. I was trying to fight with my Wi-Fi, and this is brand new fiber Wi-Fi, supposedly working great. And then all of a sudden I
Right.
can't figure out how to process and reset it. I have two apps for it, and both of the apps I couldn't get any help. And so I finally had to go on live chat with somebody and they fixed it right away. But that was
That's
my,
awesome.
you plan an hour before this podcast to kind of, check in with the Bible, kind of reset your mind, wake up, get some coffee. And my hour was just
Yeah.
like scrambling to think almost for a minute that we couldn't even do this podcast today. So yeah, I'm
Right on.
biased against and for technology, I think. So I don't even know if that's in our notes, but
Nope.
early adopters, people that are, yeah, technology, let's go. I just saw a video too of like Apple Vision Pro, which I've not used, but there's so many videos about how this is like the worst thing, or there's some good things, but just why is this 3,500 bucks? There's a lot of downfalls to it too, as being a
Yep.
Gen 1 product that,
Yep.
and Apple even had to cut back their orders because people weren't buying it. Imagine that.
Yeah.
But the interesting part is it's like it had to come out because you have to have a Gen 1 of something. And so
Sure.
now they can build off of it. I'll wait for 10 years when there's like maybe $1,000 version that does kind of cool stuff that's not like this giant block on your face.
Yeah, a friend of mine is really into the Samsung side of everything, and he sent me a Quest, I guess, right? And he got a new one, and he sent me the old one, and he was like, "We could play poker, or we could play, this game or that game or whatever." And I was like, "Hey, I mean, I'll try it out." And I
Yeah.
mean, it's all right,
Yeah.
but you know,
Yeah, VR
I found
is,
myself just kind of like over it pretty
I
quickly
know.
because it's just clunky.
Yep.
Everything's clunky. Yeah.
VR like 5+ years ago. I mean, there was the 3D TVs forever that everyone's going to be watching TV in 3D, and quickly people are like,
We're in the
no, yeah, we're not really into that. Even the movie theaters stopped doing it. That was a phase like with Avatar. I don't even know how many years ago now, 10?
Yep.
That
Something like
everyone's
that,
like
yeah.
3D is the next thing, and then VR was a big thing, and I even got a PlayStation VR, but just never really used it much because I got headaches, and it was just
Yep.
like, it's a cool like tech demo and maybe 30 minutes of it, but that's not going to be your go-to gaming thing. And I think this is
Yeah.
kind of the new thing with augmented reality of, yeah, I could see it's getting there, but it still needs a lot of improvement. So
Wearable
anyway,
technology is really challenging, that's for
yeah,
sure. But anyways, back to our topics.
back to bias. Yeah. So I'm excited to talk about this because, a lot of times we just think the bias has to do with, race, religion, some kind of
Yep.
demographic thing that we're biased against. And granted, that is the form of a lot of biases. But the topic today is more about biases that are not inherently wrong, because bias is how we process the world. It's how you determine threats. It's how you determine if someone's a friend. It's how you determine, how I can relate to somebody by understanding where they're coming from and things like that. The example before we hit record was like our security team at church. Like they have to be biased towards people coming in that might be a threat. And so they're going to look for
Right.
things that, maybe they're wearing a trench coat, which happened at one of our services in the summer in Arizona. Someone wore a trench coat, which doesn't happen. And it was actually funny because, they had their eye on this guy and he wasn't all there, but also like He was with someone else. We're like, he's probably okay. But then he reaches in the middle of service, he reaches into his pocket, pulls out this giant metal thing. And our security's like, oh my gosh, it's going down. Right. And it turns out it was like a metal Chinese fan that you fan yourself with. So
Jeez.
this guy like just freaked everyone out. But anyway,
I bet.
like they had to be biased against someone like that because, you know, there are times that people will look a certain way or do a certain thing and it puts you on
Yep.
guard. And it doesn't mean you don't love the person, just means that, you know, if you meet someone for the first time, you know, you're trying to relate to them, you know, where are they coming from? What, you know, state are they from? What did they like to
Yep.
do? And that might lead you towards a bias of trying to relate to them. It doesn't mean it's a bad thing. And so that's what we want to talk through today. And before we do that, I'll give you some scripture on what the Bible says about biases and love. Luke 6:27, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you and bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. So, you know, this just goes back to the fact that no matter who's biased, even against us, because people will have
Mm-hmm.
biases against us on how we do things in ministry, how we do things in life. You're
Yep.
not parenting correctly. And so I have a bias against your parenting. I have a bias that you homeschool versus going to public school. Whatever the bias is, people will have that against us.
Right.
And at the end of the day, we have to do all things with love. Even if we have a bias or someone else has a bias, those who hate us, we have to bless them, pray for them.
So I'm curious, when you think about meeting someone for the first time, what do you think, like, or what would you imagine could be some of their biases towards you? So like
Me
looking,
personally?
yeah, like looking
Yeah.
back at yourself. Because I think about this, I don't know that I think about this like all the time. And I don't put like a ton of weight to it, but I think there's like great awareness in just recognizing how I'm perceived.
Yeah.
So I'm
Uh,
curious, what do you think people would say about you or could say about you?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think for me, you know, I'm 6'4", I'm taller, and I think a lot of people are intimidated by height, maybe. I mean, I've had people at my retail job, like there was this one lady, she's like, ah, you're too tall, you're too tall. She's like freaking out, putting her hand up like I'm this giant or something. So, I mean, it was comical
That's
and she
awesome.
wasn't all there in the head, but you know, I think that might be something. I think also, you know, I don't have a natural smile all the time. And so sometimes,
Okay.
you know, this is my natural look. And so it might look that I'm angry. People also might have a bias against, I have a dry sense of humor. And so if I
Mhm.
say something that I trying to get a rise out of somebody or that I know is a
Ah,
joke to me, they might interpret it as not a joke. So I think
interesting.
those three things for me. What about you?
So I like what you said about like the face you can make. You know, I'm a very enthusiastic person. I'm a very passionate person. I've also been labeled intense. I'm intense. I am. I'm competitive and anything that I do, I want to do it well. I want to do it to the best of my ability. And even on here, right? Like I get loud, but I get serious. And sometimes it's like, oh, he's yelling and he's angry. And it's like, I'm an intense guy. So I'm usually pretty aware of my facial expressions when I'm meeting somebody for the first time. I try to just kind of be overly like, oh, okay, like just kind of overly trying to smile and, you know, eyebrows up. Don't try to like lean in too much. And yet that, and then my personality, I talk loud, I talk a lot. I can intimidate people, certainly not because of size. I don't have the 6'4" thing going for me, but just I don't want to come across like arrogant, you know, and I don't want to
Yeah.
come across like overly confident, but I know that I have in the past. Like I know that I've had that feedback enough times to where I say, hey, there's enough consistency to this. I should probably look into it. So I
Yeah.
try to be aware of that. And especially when speaking from stage, you know, I don't want to come across like I just know it all. But
Sure.
at the same time, when you're confident, when you're talkative, when you're expressive, when you're intense, sometimes all those things wrapped up into one, you know, people can read you a certain way that's pretty consistent. So yeah,
Yeah.
I try to be aware of that. Try to, when I meet somebody for the first time, try to take the approach of leaning in with curiosity and try to really let them lead the conversation. Because once I get going, sometimes I can just drag it. And so I want to make sure that they know that I'm here to hear them and all that.
Here's a book recommendation if you are interested listening. It's called Cues from Vanessa Van Edwards. It's about
Mm.
mastering The secret language of charismatic communication, small signals make incredible impact. So I have this book. I heard her on I think it was on Global Leadership Summit, actually.
Yeah, she was on. I was just about to say she
Yeah.
was on GLS the year I actually went out to Arizona to be
Oh,
there. So
nice.
yeah,
So anyway, I got the book. I didn't finish it because it's a lot of like small things you kind of have to process and maybe work on before you move to the next one. But if you're interested in how our nonverbals affect communication, that's an excellent book for that. So, a couple more verses before we dive into the different biases. Acts 10:35, the Apostle Peter said, God shows no partiality, but in every nation, anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him. This was at a time when the Gentiles were, quote, not allowed into, the Jewish tradition for the most part. And then James 2:1 also says, God shows no partiality. And as you hold to your faith in the Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory. So God's not a God of partiality. He is love, but, our episode on the Methodist movement released last week, or actually this week. And, at the time of this recording, it'll be a few weeks in there. And there was a lot of comments on, yeah, but God is love. And, there is a very clear distinction between God's love and also God's judgment
right,
and God
right,
allowing things versus allowing everyone to be what they want to be, and hopefully they come to him. But God being love doesn't mean that he doesn't also stand for righteousness. But God doesn't show partiality in this sense that anyone can come to him, anyone can repent. The gospel is for everyone. It's not just for white Americans. It's not just for a certain culture. It's not just for Jews or Gentiles. It's for everyone. And that's the
right.
beauty of the gospel, is that you don't have to do all these rules or look a certain way. You can come as you are, and God will not keep you as you were.
And that's what's so great about Jesus. Like, can we just acknowledge that for a second? I mean, if like coming as you are,
Mm-hmm.
like not having to, like one of my most favorite things to say is we don't have to change in order for Jesus to offer this to us. We don't have to change in order for Jesus to love us. Jesus is the resource by which we are changed.
Yeah.
So we come into relationship with Jesus, and then it's through conviction, it's through that relationship that we change. And man, how wonderful that is, because all of us, me, you, and everyone listening and everyone watching, all of us, we're terrible. Like, we have a past that we could just line up and say, yeah, we're awful people and we shouldn't be offered this grace and this mercy and this love and this eternal life. But we can come as we are and then grow in our understanding and character of Christ. So it's just a great reminder. Like, that's why we love Jesus. That's why we preach Jesus. That's why we do this podcast and talk about keeping our eyes on Jesus, because without that, we would all be doomed.
Yeah. For sure.
So it's a wonderful thing. And I love you spoke about Acts and you spoke about James. All that's echoed in Romans. It's echoed in Colossians. It's a thread throughout the Bible. Like, God shows no partiality.
Right.
And so this is what we love.
Yeah. And so as we go through these different biases, as you're listening, just follow along with us and think to yourself, like, how does this bias either take place in my life, in my family,
Yep.
if you're in ministry? This is a great kind of check for how are we potentially biased. And some of these are just kind of casual. Some of them are a little more serious, but the
Sure.
point of all this is to think that, okay, I might have this tendency to have a bias, but how do I, still see someone else as being in the image of God? How do I still love them? How do I not let my bias show to the point, that I become this bitter person? And also, some of them are internal. Some of these are internal biases and nobody knows but us. But if they're affecting you a certain way, it will allow your actions to look a different way. And so no one may know that your action is a result of this bias, but you should know internally that once you hear these biases, these might have more of a play than you might have thought they had. And so the first one we're going to look at is recency bias. So this is a cognitive bias that favors recent events over historic ones. It's also a memory bias that gives greater importance to the most recent event, such as a final lawyer's closing argument. As a jury hears that before being dismissed to deliberate, that might be the only thing they think of instead of the previous argument. And this has a lot of implications, and this is kind of the main bias I was thinking of when we were coming up with the topic today was, how does this take place in both our lives with technology, with literature, with the arts, with this idea of wisdom versus knowledge, because there's no doubt
Yep.
that this generation has more knowledge than any other generation just from what's at our
Sure.
fingertips. There's knowledge. We have, I mean, Wikipedia didn't exist. You have to go to a library to just read one book and get like a small glimpse on a subject. And now you can know like so many quotes and so many things within minutes. So it's not really a matter of knowledge, but
Right.
wisdom. Has wisdom grown in the most recent generation we're at, within the last 5 years? Are we more of a wise generation? Are we more, as we would say as Christians, are we more focused on God? Are we more following the wisdom of the Bible versus the wisdom of man? We would say probably not in general. And
Right.
so just because this recency bias allows us to think that we have it all together, we've got it figured out, our generation figures it out, things that were called a sin in the past, we're going to call not a sin this generation because we're more progressive. We're more aligned with humanity and whatever mumbo jumbo you want to throw at it. But it's really a bad bias because when you look at the Bible, it's 2,000 years old. And if you just look at the Bible as being this quote, old book written by men, you're going to see it as irrelevant. And so many people do just because, well, it's an old book. I don't read books that are 2,000 years old. I don't read books in general. I just watch YouTube. So you immediately write off the Bible as having this ancient God-given wisdom because of a recency bias. And, this can be also something casual. Like I used to know someone that would never watch a movie that was more than 20 years old, just as a matter of principle, I guess. But I mean, there's some great movies in the 50s, 60s, 70s. I mean, come on, like just having that as a bias means you're going to miss
Yep.
out on things
Right.
from the past. Or if you don't read other ancient literature besides the Bible, I mean, C.S. Lewis is 100
Yeah.
plus, 100, not less than 100 years ago. There's A.W. Tozer just in the 1900s. I mean, there's Spurgeon, there's Luther, you can learn wisdom from all these writers of biblical stuff or just writers like Plato, Socrates. I mean, the list goes on and on of wisdom that was had in previous generations, regardless if they had a smartphone or not.
Yeah, but that all sounds hard. Like, why would I want to read the Bible when I have a plethora of pastors, scholars, and even 20-year-olds that heard pastors and scholars, and even teenagers that heard 20-year-olds that heard pastors and scholars
Yeah.
talk about the Bible? Like, why would I want to read the Bible when the easy way is just to circumvent all the effort and all the time alone spent with God and all the discipline and hard work and thinking and wrestling? Like, let's just circumvent all that. Let's make it super easy. Let's make it transactional. And let's grow up in a generation that's full of podcasts like this and video clips and reels and TikToks that just tell us a little clip, like a little fortune cookie of Christianity that allows us to go about our day. And that's kind of what's going on. And it's super dangerous. And I've noticed it with my own congregation. I've been trying to bring people in on it, trying to correct it, trying to help people understand. But, it's hard because I'm also part of the problem, right? Like I'm on several different podcasts. I have a TikTok. I have, YouTube. I'm on all the social media platforms, and I am trying to give people encouragement throughout the day, but I also want them to read their Bible. And then if they won't read their Bible, well, I'll read it for them and I'll read it to them. And it's like, we've got to figure this out. So yeah, the recency bias is really prevalent and is really running rampant. And it's honestly becoming almost like a religion within the religion.
Yeah.
And it can be really dangerous because we take people's word for it. So I was having this conversation. I'll give you an example. I was having this conversation the other day with somebody. We were talking about our most recent release of the United Methodist Church and their ruling on homosexuality when it comes to the marriage, specifically when it comes to pastors and people in leadership in the church.
Episode 52. Check it out.
Episode 52. You're going to want to check that out for sure. Just follow the comment trail. And we were having a conversation about this in the Bible, and he said, yeah, I don't know as much of the Bible as you do, which I'm like, I have a lot of work to do also. He's like, so I would be interested to find scripture that backs this up. Could you share that with me? And I'm like, when was the last time you got in the word yourself and just didn't take it from somebody else?
Yeah.
And he was like, well, I read this article, and I was like, no, And he's like, well, I saw this video. And I'm like, no. When did you open your Bible, say, God, would you just reveal to me something new, something fresh that I could take with me today? And when was the last time you did that? When was the last time you prayed? When was it? Oh, well, I don't do it as much as I should. And that's the token answer, right? I certainly don't do it as much as I should. I certainly could do better. Yet, you can tell me everything about your favorite football team. You can tell me the roster. You can tell me the stats. You can tell me all the talking heads' opinions on ESPN. You can tell me all the podcasts you listen to about the talking heads on ESPN, about the stats, about the players, about all the things you know. You can tell me the last time you bought a jersey, the last time you watched a game, you can tell me all this about your favorite football team. But when it comes to the creator God, you're just gonna, I'll take this guy on TikTok. I really like the way he says it. Like,
Right.
oh, we're talking about life and death, or we're talking about your favorite football team. So this is a dangerous habit to get into, and I'm finding it running more and more rampant in this generation. And look, I had to snap out of it too. Early on in my 20s, I was all about, instead of going to church and instead of reading the Bible, I listened to pastors preach to me. And I wasn't even part of their congregation. But we've got to snap out of that. We got to grow out of that. We got to go deeper than that. We've got to long for the relationship. So I just, I encourage people to you got to learn it for yourself. And that takes work. That takes discipline. And I know it's easier to just take whatever the latest and greatest thing is, and, whatever the best sermon is that you can find from Craig Groeschel or Stephen Furtick or Michael Todd or, whatever. But that can be a dangerous place to be sometimes.
Yeah. And we can even be biased on technology with a recency bias where, if the sermon's not in 4K, if it's not like with the fancy lights, then I might see it on my YouTube, but I'm going to skip past it and find the one that looks flashy, because they're going to say truth. Well, not necessarily. I mean, there's some great sermons from Billy Graham, from David Wilkerson. I mean, a lot of people in the past that it's going to be grainy. It's going to be maybe black and white, but can you still listen to it and learn something?
Yeah.
And I think
we'll learn from Michael Todd. He just preached a sermon that was like 40 years old, and he just took it word for word and preached it.
Gosh.
So, I mean, there must be some value there.
I didn't look into that, but I saw the headline. So anyway, I think with recency bias, what we can do, and what I've done, is we take away the humanity of previous generations, and we also take away their emotions. And what I mean by that is when you look at previous generations and you see it as a historical event, and you see like a war, for example. I just watched a awesome documentary in World War II, and it really brought like some of the humanity elements at play, because it showed video, which I still don't know how we have so much video of this war. It's crazy in the 40s.
It is crazy.
There's so much video, but this video showed like angles from like the German side of things, or the Japanese side of things, or England or France or US. And it humanized a lot of these people that were like, oh, they're just bad, they're evil. Instead of like, well, these were people that they weren't Hitler, but they were, 18-year-old kid brought into, they lived in Germany, so they're going to fight for Germany. But, what was that kid thinking at the time? Like, what was their humanity like? They weren't just innately evil. They did evil things potentially, but, this kid had hopes and dreams. He had emotions. He was scared, like the ones that died, like what was their final moments like? Like, I just think of these things of, this was an event, check it off. I learned about it, but these were real people that were involved in it. Even in like medieval times, if you look at like, I just saw on my TikTok someone called Vlad the Impaler and all the evil things he did. And I'm just thinking like, man, like what was that like for him to come at you in your village and just destroy and burn your village? I mean, this was a village of people that had families, that had young kids, and for just these kids to be gone, and if you were a surviving parent, I mean, just putting your heart into these situations when we take away the humanity. When you read the Bible and, this person got martyred, Uriah, David killed Uriah. What was it like for Uriah to like his final moments of like, and I'm not going to see my wife again. This stinks. Like, why did I get put on the front line?
Right.
And so when we have recency bias, we often see the past as, well, humans were not like, what did they even have to live for back then? Or they didn't have like the emotional processing we had today. It's like, they were still human. They were made in God's image. They were, and so also like,
and arguably harder workers and smarter, arguably. Just arguably.
Right. I think the other caveat to this recency bias is in our personal lives, we have a recency bias with God, because we often say like, what have you done for me lately? And we often think of what he's not doing for us in our mind versus what he has done and will do. And so we have this recency bias when our immediate prayer is not answered and we're like, God, where are you? You left me, you abandoned me. Instead of, God answered your prayer 2 months ago when you were praying for your kid and they, no longer were sick, and, you were wondering where your next paycheck was coming from and you just got a new job. Like, did you forget about that? Because that was
Yeah.
2 months ago, and now you're complaining that this new thing. And so I think with God, we're often, I mean, of course, salvation, we forget our salvation so much because we just move on and the next thing. And it's like, well, we have to remember the gospel. We have to remember what we're saved from. And then as we go through life, we have to remember, which looking back in 2020, and this is why journaling is important. This is why remembering the goodness of God, the Bible talks about that so much, to remember the goodness of God, lest you forget, tell your children about
Mhm.
it, because we are so quickly to forget in this culture that's next thing, next thing, next thing, that we have to reflect, okay, God, I don't know where you are in this moment, but I know you were with me last month and last year, and I know you're going to be with me through this storm. And so I'm going to see it to the end, and I'm going to see your goodness through it, and I'll be able to reflect on it later because I might have God-given hindsight at a future date. I still may not know all the reasons why, but I can trust you in the storm.
All right. Can I give us an example of this? And it's incredibly, I don't know. It's
Go for it.
it's a weak moment for me. Okay.
Yes.
So God reminded me of something. This is literally within the last week. I was standing in the backyard of my house, in my neighborhood, and looking at my yard and looking at all the things that I could do with my yard. And, in my yard currently, I have some small bushes, and I've got almost an acre of land, which is pretty cool in this area. And I've got a play set, and I've got a trampoline, and I got a fence, but I don't have any privacy trees. And I'm looking at where we could put in privacy trees. And then I'm thinking about how much everything costs. And I'm like, it's just so expensive. And I'm just going, man, why does everything have to be so expensive? This is ridiculous. I shouldn't have to pay this much just for privacy trees. I just want some green giants over there and some over there. I could plant them myself. And I'm going through all these things. And then I eventually, about 15 minutes later, I'm sitting here going, I wonder if we could put a pool here. I wonder if we could put a pool in a pool house here. I wonder if I could leverage the equity that I have in my home. And I wonder if I could, and I'm going through all this, right? But I'm not doing it in a dreamy vision way. I'm doing it almost in a what I don't have way. And just in the middle of it, in my bad kind of attitude, I just get this reminder from God. It's like, hey, remember that time you were homeless and living out of your Ford Ranger truck? Remember that? Remember those prayers? Remember when you used to think you'd never have a roof over your head? Remember that one? Remember the time you had all your clothes in the back bed of your truck and it rained and all your clothes got super wet, and so you had to put on clothes that smelled like mildew for about 3 weeks? You remember that? Because you didn't even have enough money to go to the laundromat. Remember that? And it's like, oh yeah, that's right. So maybe I should shut up. Maybe I should stop. Maybe I should stop complaining about finances, or stop complaining about privacy trees, or stop complaining about this stuff, because I'm standing in my backyard with my wife and my 2 kids, and I have a home. So maybe I should shut up. And so I just got this little tap on the shoulder like, hey, you're living in your answered prayer, and you have the audacity to complain. You're in the middle. Every time you walk outside, you shouldn't see a yard that's half built. You should go, my prayer has been answered. And you're sitting here talking about green giants and privacy trees. Cut me a break. I brought you out of homelessness. I brought you out of a Ford Ranger truck, and you now have an HOA. Cut me some slack. Get off of that. So I got a little tap on the shoulder that was very humbling, and it worked. It worked very well. It worked
Yeah.
very well. And the last few days I've been walking out in my backyard just like, yeah, no, this is great. I don't need anything. I'm good.
Yeah.
I'm
Well,
set. I'm
that's it.
content.
That's what the Israelites did. I mean, there was recency bias for them. What have you done for me lately, God? We need water, we
Yeah,
need food, and God's like, I got you, but can you trust me? Did you not see
right.
the Red
Did
Sea? Did you not
did you
see?
see? Yeah. Did you not see the manna? What are we
Yeah,
doing?
I
What are
know.
we doing here?
And then they wanted ravens, and then they died off of the raven. I mean, it's just
So
like
so crazy.
it's the human condition of always like the next thing, the latest thing, and this
Yep.
comes through with what we consume. And like if you're an early adopter in technology, you want this new thing, you want this new car, and as soon as you get it, you're like, yeah, it's not all that, but it's like
Right.
it's a matter of contentment in a way.
It is.
I think in a big way is when you just want the next big thing and you don't remember what you have, you're not thankful for your blessings. And I think that's why we put ourselves in a posture of thanking God in prayer, not just asking for things. We thank him before our meals, not because we have to, but we put ourselves in a position of understanding where everything comes from. And I
Yep.
think the more that we ingrain that habit in our lives, the more thankful we can be, so that when things come that we wish we had, or we, compare ourselves with the Joneses down the street, I mean, it can allow us to see like, yeah, you know what? I don't have Apple Vision Pro, but I'm so blessed to have the things I do have.
And it's important for you to take inventory of how quick it shifts.
Yeah.
Like when you go buy a new car, the first time it's dirty, the first time it's got a scratch or a dent, the first time you have to put gas in it, the first time you thought it did something that it doesn't do,
Hmm.
which is usually within the first like 48 hours, you're over it. You're over it.
Yeah.
I remember when I got a new set of golf clubs and the first bad shot I hit, I was over it.
Gotta be the
So
golf
I
clubs. Yeah.
got to be the golf clubs. So my wife was kind enough for, I don't remember, I think it was my birthday. She got me a new pair of golf clubs. It was unbelievable. And I was like, I can't wait to play with these. I went out and I played a decent round of golf, but I hit a few bad shots. And the first bad shot I hit, I was like, these clubs suck. And it's amazing that I can have a new pair of golf clubs or an old pair of golf clubs and still shoot the same,
Yeah.
mainly, and have a new pair of golf clubs or an old pair of golf clubs and still have the same attitude when I hit a bad shot. So it doesn't take long. And so it's good to take inventory of like, how quick do I get over things?
Yeah.
And then you go, I want that. And then you go, I'll get over it so quickly. And you just
Right.
start learning to be content with what you have.
Yeah. That's good. I think recency bias also comes into play with our relationships. We want the newest, the latest, the greatest, and hopefully not when you're married, but definitely when you're dating. There's this
Yep.
honeymoon phase that goes away, and all of a sudden, the sparks aren't flying like they were. And so you want a new one. And unfortunately, that does happen in marriages because, after the honeymoon phase is over, you're like, well, I don't feel like what I felt before. And instead of pushing through those feelings and fighting through tension, you often go to quick fixes, which is stuff on the internet or things in person, because you want those feelings again. And when we're driven by feelings, we tend to think of the most recent hit, if you will, of whatever we're trying to get, whether it's a new toy or a new video game or a new relationship. And I think, recency bias is dangerous in those contexts because, there is something to be said and biblical for marriages that last 50, 60 years. I mean, it's not that they never disliked each other. It's not that they never
Right.
fought. It's not that they weren't even not attracted to each other at some point. I mean, you go through phases of life when, you push through your feelings or your initial thoughts because there's a deeper commitment, there's a covenant
Right.
at play. And that's kind of lost in our world when we see things we're like, oh, I wish I had that or what have you.
Yeah, I think we've talked about this before, but I mean, if you look at divorce rates, there's a reason that you're over 50% if you go to percentages that take out people that have been married more than once, so 2, 3, 4 times. Then divorce rates drop below 40%. And then if you go to Christian marriages, they drop below 30%. And then if you go to marriages that pray together daily, like it's almost nothing.
Right.
It's literally almost 0%. It's less than 2%. So it's perspective. It's being content. It's having that fight, within you. And I actually had meeting with a couple that's getting married this past week, and I'm marrying them in late June. And we were just talking about marriage and what it's about and all this. And I'm like, you got to remember you're on the same team, and you got to remember you're not fighting with each other. You're fighting for one another. And
Right.
so if you were on a team, you'd be wearing the same jerseys, and you got to remember that. You always got to remember that. And we were just talking through all these different things when it comes to marriage. And I'm looking at these, 20-year-olds that have no idea really what's in front of them.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just trying to, try to do everything I can to give them wisdom. Then again, I've only been married 11 years. And so I'm sharing wisdom that I've heard from others that certainly outlast me. So yeah. And that tells you how important it is to be creative in your marriage. And, you need to, you don't want to get in a habit of like looking at other things. You want to fall in love with your wife. You want to fall in love with your spouse, like over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of different ways to do that, and we can save that for a marriage podcast episode. But we gotta. It's all about just focusing on what you have, doing good with what you have.
Yeah. We have an episode on dating your spouse. Check that out.
Yeah.
The last form of recency bias we want to talk about is in ministry. So as we are ministry leaders, you might lead a ministry or be a pastor if you're listening. How does recency bias affect us in our churches? And I don't know, I would say for me, being over finances, it's often that, oh man, attendance wasn't what it was at today, or the offering wasn't what it was at today. This ship is going down. We need to figure something out. I can tend to go to the worst case scenario. Instead of remembering, like, God, you brought us through summer, you brought us through Christmas, you brought us through all these things. Like, we're still going strong. We're still like, we believe we have a vision and mission you've given us. It's not our vision, but hey, finances are important. And so that can be a sticking point. It can also be, with attendance, it can be something that, the sermon was great. We had 5 people come to the altar, and we had, 5 people salvation and baptisms and all these things, but attendance was down 20%. It wasn't a great Sunday. Man, what are we doing?
That's tough.
Can we look at the wins of what God's doing and not with just what we think he should have done? I mean, that's how it comes to play with ministry, I think. What about you?
Well, let's talk about how we fix that. So let me ask you a question, because, you said because you're over finances, you can quickly get to those things of like low attendance, we're a sinking ship. So let me ask you this. How do you measure a Sunday being successful for you personally? Not necessarily for a church, but like, how do you walk out of the building on a Sunday and go to your car and go, this was a success? And it's tough. It is.
There's a lot of different things you could point at.
There is. And this is something I ask our volunteers a lot, because if you're measuring your success on things you can't control, then you've given yourself over to the world. You've given yourself over to things that are completely just variable. If you measure your success on attendance, if you measure your success on giving, if you measure your success on, salvation and things like that, man, those are things the Holy Spirit's convicting people of and stirring in people. Those are things that are out of your control. Certainly you can set the environment for it, but a great environment doesn't always equal salvation, and a bad environment doesn't always equal not a salvation.
Right.
So how can you walk away knowing I had a great Sunday? And this is important for pastors as well, because if attendance is low, or if you didn't get the response, people weren't amening during the sermon, they didn't like it, you can get into that real quick. So I always try to make sure it's like, hey, have something measurable that you can take to your car. So for me, I want to make sure I'm in conversations with people, and I want to make sure I'm having ministry moments with people, which means I'm moving through a lot of people and I have to get to ministry quick. And so if I can walk to my car and go, I had 5 ministry moments today. I connected with 5 people in a very genuine, authentic way. I found out what's going on in their life, and I had a ministry moment with them. If I had 5 ministry moments on a Sunday morning, and when I walk to my car, I'm like, today was a success. And I can have 5 ministry moments as long as there's 5 people there. And I know there's going to be 5. So finding a metric, finding something that's measurable that you can control is really valuable. Otherwise, like you said, you can really quickly be like, well, attendance is up, we're crushing it, the sermon was amazing. It's like, well, maybe.
Yeah, maybe, right.
Maybe it was just a back-to-school weekend, Who knows?
Right. Yeah, that's really good. That's wisdom. And I think, when I look at that question, it really comes down to, were we faithful to do what we were supposed to do? you
Yeah.
know, regardless of technology working or new people showing up, you know, having those moments. Cause I think of when I'm most charged, recharged, and excited from a Sunday is when I get to pray for people, when I get to have a prophetic word for someone, or when I get to meet someone that's brand new who has never been to
Yeah.
church. And I'm like, wow, this is like the first experience you have of being in a church setting. We want to make sure we honor that and answer your questions and that kind of stuff. So I think that
Yeah.
comes down to ministry moments too, when you put that term on it, as far as what is actually successful. Or someone you haven't seen in 6 months comes and they're like, oh man, I just been doing this and I really need to get back into it.
Yeah.
Like that's a win right there. That's not,
Yeah.
and you would never know that unless you talk to people. Like you would never
Correct.
know a lot of that stuff. And there's still a lot of stuff that I don't know from Sunday from people that either don't share or I'm not able to talk with, or, and so that's why it's important to have those ministry moments. So
Yeah, and that's going to be where your language, your verbiage, your empathy, that's going to be where it spills over from.
yeah.
When you find out the person in your congregation that for the last 10 years has been cancer-free finds out their cancer's back,
Mm.
it's going to change the way you speak from stage.
Yeah.
It's going to change the way you talk about faith. It's going to change the way you talk about the power of the Holy Spirit. It's going to change you. And so that's what we're called to do, is speak over our congregation. Well, you got to know your
Yeah.
congregation in order to do that. So that's really cool, man. It's good.
Well, Drew, we got to one bias, recency bias. So if you're
Yeah, I feel
listening,
like we should maybe do a part 2.
yeah, we need to do a part 2. So if you're listening, let us know about recency bias specifically, since we spent a lot of time on there. What specifically in your life have you seen recency bias take form, and maybe what you can do to prevent that or combat it, like we've talked about and have been vulnerable with. And so next week, we're going to talk about a lot more biases. We have confirmation bias, hindsight bias, anchor observer bias, self-serving bias, halo effect, availability, heuristic. Yeah, what do those mean? We'll talk about them in
It's a lot.
practical ways that we can combat biases. So until next week, go with God, grow in discernment, and keep your eyes on Jesus.
Thanks for joining us on the Eyes on Jesus podcast with Drew and Tim. Don't forget to hit subscribe